everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
When I use the word decisions, people always gravitate towards the decision point, which is like, what was the choice set and which one did we pick and why? But here's what's really interesting. There's weeks and months that teams spend trying to disambiguate a problem, trying to understand a problem and put, recommendations on the table. It's those weeks and months of work that is a little bit hidden in my view, because today, if you ask people, how's it done? They will say, well, we had a bunch of brainstorms and deep dives and alignment meetings, and here we are now. We're at the decision point, and we have a big, commitment that we're trying to get the company to buy into. So if you don't handle the upstream work, which is, the point from which you have the idea to the point at which, you're putting, decisions or recommendations on the table, if you handle that well, you would avoid a lot of pitfalls, and you would not only streamline it, but you would make higher quality decisions.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today I'm joined by Atif, Rafiq, president, board member, author, and influencer. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks so much. It's great to join you, Scott.
So would it be reasonable to say that you're one of the pioneers when it comes to Internet 1.0 with AOL back in the 1990s, and then writing out the .com with Covigna, I believe, that was acquired by ProQuest?
Well, you're taking me back in the time capsule. But yeah, that's absolutely right. It's hard to remember, but AOL, the company America Online, it's kind of like today's, Facebook or today's Meta or today's Amazon. It was really the center of gravity on the internet. I was lucky enough to get started very early in 1996 when I was in my early 20s, and that just helped me stay in the most interesting aspects of the technology sector, since that time. So yeah, I was very steeped in 1.0 and then have just continued to ride different waves. Of course, that's changed over time.
Well, I think timing has been very fortuitous for you. You've also served as a chief digital officer at McDonald's, Volvo, and most recently as a president in commercial and growth at MGM. And having gone through Web.1, Web.2, and now Web3, I wonder, what does it mean to digitally transform large blue chip companies?
Yeah, so in 2013, I became the first chief digital officer in the history of the Fortune 500. And that was sort of a new wave for the internet, because internet was considered sort of just pure play tech companies. Everything, the product was software, right? And in 2013, Mark Andreessen coined the phrase "software is eating the world." And the implication was that companies, whether they're in the resorts business like MGM or they do quick serve restaurants like McDonald's, their business model or customer experience is transformed by technology. We now know that to be obvious because it's 10 years later. But when I made the leap and worked for the CEO of McDonald's, coming out of Amazon, that was not obvious. That was a personal risk, for me in terms of a career move. Many people did not understand it, in terms of people from Silicon Valley that I knew, and certainly people within McDonald's who were wondering why, the chief digital officer and that objective around digitization was a thing. But obviously it played out. And for digitization, of traditional companies, it often means, rethinking from the customer perspective what the experience is around the product or the service, and as well as the business model. And then there's a whole ton of change that goes beyond that. It's structural. It's setting up different ways of looking at performance, as ways of working. So it's a very involved transformation on what you do as a business or how you serve customers, but also how you collaborate internally to be much more agile. So I was lucky enough to be part of that wave for 10 years.
And I think something that's probably understated is that in some of those capacities that you've played, is that certainly it's about technology or transformative aspects, but at the same time, underlying all of that is really organizational development and change management. And fundamentally, and you start to allude to this, is that you take a traditional fast food type of company or resort company and trying to change it, the fundamental DNA, it starts to rub some people the wrong way. And I wonder how you went about making those changes come alive. And I think some of this you start to kind of get into a little bit around your latest book, Decision Sprints, the new way to innovate into the unknown and move from strategy to action.
Well, it's a great point. I talked a little bit earlier about the how component, and that is where you need to spend a good amount of time. How does the company, think through problems that it's trying to solve, and what does it eventually decide to ship to the customer? So, for example, the notion of product ownership is not a concept that existed in the Fortune 500 before I was trying to introduce it. Of course, it exists in Google and Netflix and Amazon, but it didn't exist in a car company or in a restaurant company. And you have to create some clarity around what do you mean by that? Digital product ownership. Why is it important? Because the customer needs to have a voice, and you need to have somebody who is obsessed with the customer experience and is continuously thinking about what good looks like. Because traditional companies have usually built their service or their experience around their internal perspective as opposed to backwards from the customer. So that one change unlocks a lot. It's and this, once you break it down, you can get some buy-in in the organization. Wow, that would work a lot better for the customer. Why are we doing it this way? Then in terms of how to get there, certainly you need to bring in new skill sets. You're talking about UX, product management, in-house engineering. Those are all very important because you want to put those teams together in a two-pizza team or a squad where they're constantly problem solving on behalf of the customer. So even within the changes I just elaborated, that's a lot to digest in a traditional organization. But, turning to my book a little bit, where it falls short is a good way to involve the rest of the company, because generally speaking, the most meaningful things you're going to do, they take input from across the organization. So to really solve big customer problems, you need more than your digital team. You need operations, you need maybe marketing, you need people in the field, for example, who visit restaurants. How do you bring their input together so that you don't have a blind spot as you begin to develop a solution, if that makes sense? And so we need a way to do that. I learned along the way over this 10-year period how to have an inclusive approach to innovation, which is what I've written about.
Yeah. And I think that's a key point around inclusion, and we'll come back to that in just a second. Going back to what you said about customer journey personas, is that from a customer-centric point of view, is that we've seen some pretty dramatic changes in the last 5-7 years. So if you think about McDonald's as an example, things like AI, where you order, you're not necessarily talking to a cashier that's taking your order there. They could be someplace else, but now it's starting to be substituted with AI. And then, of course, you have food delivery. So even the app and to the kiosk experience is changing. And that's certainly for MGM and other types of casinos. Now you have sports betting apps. You could do it from your phone without having to visit the resort, for example. So there's a lot of changes. So as you implement these changes, but yet the customers and those journeys are also changing as well constantly, how do you make sure that you're keeping up to speed and that the investments that you're making, you're realizing the returns before you move on to the next evolution?
Well, you look at performance entirely different. A traditional company might just look at the outputs, which is the financial results, but you're really focused on developing and measuring the right input metrics. And input metrics, just to give you an example, I mean, it's one thing to say we have a resort, we have a certain amount of rooms in our hotel. What's our occupancy, right? Is it 70%? It is 80%. And those things really matter in terms of, how your company is doing financially. But what are the indicators that are much more upstream around whether you're going to get there? You might look at things like the number of searches done in your app for the resorts, or for example, the number of itineraries that are built before people arrive on the property, as an indicator for how much they're actually going to spend once they're there. So in a company like Amazon in particular, you obsess over input metrics, because those are the things that give you an indication that the financial outcomes you're going to look at are going to be realized. And it gives you more time to respond, to be agile. And so when you set up a company in this way, now you need to educate, what are input metrics? How to create these dashboards? Who's involved in reviewing them? What are the kinds of actions we can take if we're not on track? And that is a more responsive, sort of agile way of running your business. But you can't just sort of explain it. You actually have to set up the organization, bring in the right skills, and have the right interfaces so that you can take the right actions when you get those insights.
Well, I really appreciate you talking about upstreaming and the upstreaming work that you're talking about, for example, the inputs and how that cascades into the dashboards and the kind of metrics that you look at as well. Because if you look at retail as an example and brands, they were too obsessed with square footage, sales per square footage, and they were missing the upstream of some of the interactions that were happening online. And surely enough, over the last decade, we've seen too many brands that have gone by the side in some sort of foreclosure or bankruptcy. Now, you mentioned something that's interesting. High velocity, high quality decision-making is important, but your advice about is counterintuitive. What do you mean by that?
Well, when I use the word decisions, people always gravitate towards the decision point, which is like, what was the choice set and which one did we pick and why? But here's what's really interesting. There's weeks and months that teams spend trying to disambiguate a problem, trying to understand a problem, and put recommendations on the table. It's those weeks and months of work that is a little bit hidden, in my view, because today, if you ask people how's it done, they will say, well, we had a bunch of brainstorms and deep dives and alignment meetings, and here we are now. We're at the decision point, and we have a big commitment that we're trying to get the company to buy into. So if you don't handle the upstream work, which is the point from which you have the idea to the point at which you're putting decisions or recommendations on the table, if you handle that well, you would avoid a lot of pitfalls, and you would not only streamline it, but you would make higher quality decisions. And so I've given a name to this body of work, and I call it upstream work, and it consists of 3 stages: exploration, alignment, and decision making. So just to break them down very quickly, exploration is the process of surfacing the unknowns and doing a good job of getting to the bottom of them. Alignment is the process of looking at what's been learned to draw conclusions. And decision making is about taking the conclusions that we've drawn and are aligned around and identifying the right actions to proceed with. And I actually go much further than that with use cases, but also detailed workflows. In my book, Decision Sprint, there are 13 workflows that can help any team progress an idea to the point at which decisions are made so it can move on to execution, but the right execution against the right direction for the initiative. That's the general idea. And I have a lot of experience with it at well-known companies, whether it's a very agile company like Amazon to companies that are more traditional, that I was able to get pockets of those organizations to really move a higher velocity.
Well, we certainly have read and heard quite a bit around some of those theoretical frameworks around how to innovate, and there's a lot of work that's been done there. But I think the value that you're bringing is the operational experience. It's one thing to have a framework or methodology on the how, the process, but this notion of upstream work, the way you've detailed it, is based on work that you've actually applied, and it there's actually tangible results from it. So it's a repeatable process, which is hugely important. The other thing, this body of work that you talk about embodies this notion of the knowledge work. And I think you started to talk about that is there's a lot of hidden things that people do that we don't understand or appreciate, but they just come to the meeting with the final decision points or the options. Talk to us about, in your book, when you talk about the future of knowledge work, what do you mean by that? And specifically, as we think about generative AI, how does that help support and increase the productivity?
Well, it's going to be a seismic change that I feel very confident about, where there's this terminology that has a legacy connotation, which is, what do they call it? Knowledge management, right? Where it's like, whoa, that's a 40-year-old term. What in the world does that even mean? That never made any sense for a long time, because there was no way to keep up with the speed at which a company is learning things against the problems and initiatives that's pursuing. There was no way to distill that into like, oh, this is the knowledge we actually have. But now there will be, and let me break that down. So what I'm imagining is, with a system like Decision Sprint, which basically helps a team develop the right set of questions to explore a problem and then get to the bottom of them and produce answers and connect the answers that they're coming up with to the conclusions that they're drawing. Doing that in a structure, and with software, which I think is going to be important, you begin to get visibility and transparency to, well, how did we get here? Well, we have an initiative. What are the key factors and matters that we're considering? What is our perspective on them? You might have like a list of FAQs, for example. So you'll begin to have actually bring some visibility to the knowledge that you have around an initiative that the company is pursuing. So that's sort of eliciting more of the collective intelligence that's exists within the company. I think that will begin to generate some data lakes and some repositories for companies to tap into. And I'll come back to how we see generative AI today in the public internet context, but imagine a private knowledge repository where you point ChatGPT or an instance of Bard at it, and now you have the proprietary knowledge of the organization, and you can begin to have meetings where you ask Bard or ChatGPT, what do we know about X? And it's not searching the 4 billion web pages as a corpus, but it's taking the knowledge that the teams in your organization have been working through and sort of developing, and it's making that available for you to bring into conversations. In terms of the public internet and generative AI as we see it today, I think that helps teams. Basically, it can help them with suggestions. So let's say you're a retailer, you're thinking about a loyalty program, you haven't done it before, but guess what? It's not the first time it's been done in the world. So you can ask ChatGPT questions like, what are the main risks of launching a loyalty program? How do we manage liabilities? And how does the financial equation work and benefit us? And you may not get perfect answers, but you get a lot of suggestions about things you should be thinking about and including in your exploration, in your discovery work, so that you don't have a blind spot. And so I see, what we have available today is an ability to leverage generative AI to help us go faster, because it will raise questions and considerations that we should not miss as we're developing our strategies.
And I think you really nicely articulate some of the benefits as we start to see some of these large language models come into more of a proprietary walled environment within corporate environments, where it starts to learn off the data set, the learning. Essentially, it's the institutional knowledge you're starting to learn from. And that's really powerful. So the notion of completeness, thoroughness, as well as making sure that you mention, not missing blind spots, but also the fact that as they consider and explore these different things, that they are thinking through the organizational culture, some of the history, things that's unique to that firm, so that it's really being properly filtered through and thought through and the results. Now, with that said, the challenge is, just like even with humans in that process flow that you mentioned before, is now once we add the AI component, is there a potential for lack of transparency in terms of how AI came about it? And can we, in fact, do truly a good job of vetting out that what it's producing, it's accurate and it's reliable?
Well, I think that there's probably a long way to go on that front. And I think we'll have new roles in companies, curators of knowledge, so to speak. So that will be the art and science of basically developing confidence levels around this institutional knowledge, which you spoke about, Scott. I think that's very accurate. We will get to a point in time where enterprises have a current version of their institutional knowledge. Let's call that their intellectual capital, and that will get stale if we don't do anything about it. If we just take the same thing we had a month ago, that will definitely get stale. So then, how do you solve that? You need people thinking about, well, what are the signals around this knowledge that we have? If we broke it down into bits, let's just say something like a set of FAQs around something we're working on. Let's say this loyalty program. Well, we need to basically pulse the team to say, how confident do we feel in these answers? Are they shallow? Are they out of date? Are there new factors that have changed in the world that would require us to refresh these answers? Those kinds of mechanisms will need to be developed, and I think they'll be part of the work of knowledge workers, so to speak. And then we'll have curators who are helping from a more, so I want to say, a bit centralized perspective, making sure that we're not, relying on dated information.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I think we're just starting to scratch the surface, and excited to see how all this will transform organizations for years to come. Today, I've been joined by Atif, Rafiq. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your insights.
Yeah, you're most welcome, Scott. It's been a pleasure.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.